Are people with ADHD more sensitive to rejection than, I guess, neurotypical people?
Yeah, it is thought that many people with ADHD struggle with something called RSD, rejection sensitive dysphoria. And so basically, that is the reaction that happens when we're faced with a real or perceived rejection. It's an emotional response. It's like a form of emotional dysregulation where we react really, I don't want to use the word dramatically. We really feel it. Like it's a big reaction. And a lot of the theories around this are because of all those.
You are listening to My Rejection Story, hosted by Alice Draper. Meredith, welcome to My Rejection Story. Before we get into the interview, do you mind introducing yourself and a little bit about what you do?
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Meredith Carder. I'm an ADHD coach, creator, and writer. I live in the Phoenix, Arizona area. I'm a mom of 3 and recently wrote my first book on adult ADHD.
I loved the book, so I'll just preface with that. Yeah, it was such a great book, and I felt so affirmed as someone who also has ADHD. What are the dangers of masking?
I think there's a lot that can be really tough with masking because oftentimes when we're masking, we're not just kind of subtly not showing behaviors, we're like overcorrecting for them. So we may struggle with issues at work, like perhaps we're struggling to really meet deadlines and expectations. So instead of asking for accommodations, we push ourselves super hard and we overcorrect. So we overproduce, we overdeliver. And, that can work out great for us at the beginning. And then typically we end up burning out because we're operating way beyond a capacity that makes sense for our brain. So there's that risk that it's just the exhaustion and the burnout that can come from doing way too much to overcorrect for symptoms. I also feel like there's a feeling of inauthenticity that can happen. I feel like a lack of connection that can occur when we are in social groups and work and things like that. I often talk to people that say that they're like a different person for every single situation they're in. They're almost like a chameleon. And, that's not terrible. It's great that we're adaptable. And I do think that we have often very multifaceted personalities. So that's part of it. But when we're having to completely change ourselves to fit in, that's hard work. And over time, we get tired. So we might avoid connection. We might avoid being in those situations that we have to mask. And it just can be really tough to not feel like you're accepted for how you are. If you're always having to hide something, we kind of start to live in fear of like being figured out. And that's just not a great way to go about the world.
Yeah, totally agree. In your book, you wrote, you gave an example of like spending a full day masking, and like if you are super fatigued or super exhausted at the end of the day, this might be a sign that you're masking, directly related to. So for someone who feels like this is their identity, they're mostly masking at work or with friends or in any other setting, how would one go about trying to undo that and trying to be a little bit more of their authentic self?
One thing I talk about in my book, one strategy that I think we can start with is to ditch the low reward masking first, because we're not going to like overnight just be able to show up authentically. We probably do need to mask some things, to be able to fit in. Like we can't blurt out every thought that comes into our head because we might hurt people's feelings a lot, or it's just not going to help us in our careers and things like that. So thinking about the situations in your day and where you might be masking and where you probably don't really need to be. So one of those might be if you, like, say you work in person and you have a high need for physical movement, like you're a fidgeter, oftentimes we get really hyper aware of our fidgeting and we'll just like try to sit up straight, and we're like spending a whole meeting focused on not fidgeting versus actually just letting our body do what it needs to do, and being able to tune into the meeting. So thinking about, like, instead of trying to control that behavior, is there a way to express that that's gonna not be distracting to everyone else, but also help your need for movement? Can you doodle? Can you bring a fidget with you? And try to just be accepting of those behaviors. Can you ask to stand in the back of the meeting or something like that? That would be like an example of usually like a low reward, because you not moving is really not that big of a deal to most people, most likely. So thinking about a way where you can kind of unmask that behavior, I think is really helpful. And then once you start kind of finding those low reward masking behaviors, the less of those you have to put bandwidth towards, the more energy you're going to have for everything else. So that's something I think is a great start for that. I also think that thinking about cultivating groups of people and community that you can be with that you're not required to mask. So who are those friends that you might already have that you can just kind of talk naturally, that you're not like, you can talk in tangents and interrupt each other and nobody's apologizing the whole time. Like, who are those people? And if you don't have them, see if you can start seeking out people that have a similar profile than you do. Like, find ADHD community, find a group or people that are open about that, where you feel like you can be yourself, because that's just kind of a relief to the masking we are kind of required to do by society the rest of the time.
I love that so much. So finding accommodations, which is, I think you gave some examples in your book of like, I don't know if this is related to finding accommodations, but sort of going for a walk and listening, you can absorb more information, which I totally related to, versus just sitting at a screen and listening that way. And finding a community. I have a strange question for you. Do you think people with ADHD are more drawn towards other people with ADHD? Because many of my best friends also have ADHD, and the way we talk is like manic and insane. And I think a lot of people would be, if they had to listen to us, be like, how did you guys get to like 70 different points and not finish a single like discussion that you opened? So yeah. Do you advise that we make friends?
I mean, I don't have any scientific research to back it up, but I do think that in my personal experience, it was really actually super fascinating to get diagnosed with ADHD and start talking to friends about it, because a lot of them were like, oh, I was diagnosed with ADHD in college, and they'd never told me that. Or they were like, I've been wondering if I have ADHD. And, over the last several years, a lot of them have been diagnosed, and they were people I already had connected with. And they were usually the people that I felt the most comfortable with, that I were my kind of inner circle already. So I do think there's something to that. There's a comfort in not feeling different, to feeling like people can relate to what you're going through. So if you're open enough with people and they've been able to see that window, and share that they're kind of on the same page, I think there is something going on there where we are kind of finding those people that truly get how our brain is wired.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think, if the way you talk and the way you engage with the world attracts certain people, maybe they think a little bit similar to us. It's like moving on to the topic of rejection. Are people with ADHD more sensitive to rejection than, I guess, neurotypical people?
Yeah, it is thought that many people with ADHD struggle with something called RSD, rejection sensitive dysphoria. And so basically that is the reaction that happens when we're faced with a real or perceived rejection. It's an emotional response. It's like a form of emotional dysregulation where we react really, really, I don't want to use the word dramatically. We really feel it, like it's a big reaction. And a lot of the theories around this are because of all those early messages we receive as people with ADHD that our behaviors are wrong, we're doing something wrong. So we get like a heightened awareness, and we begin to kind of respond every time in the same way, even if the threat isn't, quite as substantial. So it's a very painful thing, I think, for people to experience, but I think it's extremely common among people with ADHD that whenever I talk about this with people, they're like, oh my gosh, being able to like understand that this is a thing for me is like almost freeing, because oftentimes we know we're maybe sensitive, but we don't really realize to the extent and the amount it's impacting our decisions in our life, because it's not just that reaction that's so hard. It's the fact that we start to want to avoid that reaction. So we may change our behaviors to avoid experiencing that feeling of RSD. And that can look like anything from not pursuing opportunities, from not putting ourselves out there, from not wanting to connect socially, and things like that.
Which is a huge part of the podcast's mission, is, helping people overcome that fear of rejection and not pursuing opportunities. But before I get into that, could you, and you sort of wrote about this in your book, and so I'm curious to just get onto the podcast, could you explain a little bit in terms of what happens in our brain when we're rejected or we perceive a rejection as someone with an ADHD brain? What sort of is happening up there that makes us feel the way we feel?
Yeah, so usually what's happening is we're like, when we go into that rejection, usually we're kind of in like our zone of regulation, right? We're regulated, we're fine. And then when we perceive that rejection, we become really dysregulated. So that can look like, it can look different for everyone, but it can look like anger. It can look like physical feelings of like your face getting flushed. It can look like headaches. It can look like just kind of that physical reaction to stress. It can look like freezing. So for some people, instead of getting angry, they get frozen. For some people, they cry. It's just, it's going to be a little bit different for everyone, but it is a response of having a dysregulated nervous system. And it can happen really like regardless of the size of the rejection or the intent too.
Why do you know why we struggle, or people with ADHD struggle with regulating emotions? Is it just purely messages from childhood, or do you know if there is something else?
Yeah, emotional regulation is not currently part of the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, but it actually was for a really long time. And a lot of researchers are trying to get it back into the diagnostic criteria. But they do think it is part of our nervous system wiring to have a smaller zone of regulation. So again, that's that space where you're feeling good, you feel like you can handle stressors, you can kind of just roll with things as they come. But people with ADHD tend to move out of that range. Either they get upregulated out, which is more of like the anger and the, feeling like that kind of like intense stress, or they can also go below that, which is feeling kind of apathetic and kind of frozen in that space. So the thought around that is that our ability to stay within that zone of regulation is just smaller with how our nervous systems are wired with ADHD.
This makes sense. There's a term that you wrote about in your book, which I loved, called cognitive inflexibility. And you explain this as something that clouds our thinking and blacks out all other perspectives other than the negative intent that we've assigned to the rejection or the perceived rejection. Could you explain a little bit more what cognitive inflexibility is and why it's dangerous?
So people with ADHD struggle with executive functioning. A lot of people have heard that term, but they think it means like we're just not organized, or we, struggle with time and things like that. And it does mean that. But your executive functions are a set of self-monitoring type behaviors that happen in your prefrontal cortex. And there's differences in the ADHD brain with how our prefrontal cortexes function. So this is something that's been really like fleshed out in science, that this is really truly something we struggle with. And cognitive inflexibility is one of those executive functions. So cognitive inflexibility is that ability to like move from, one thought to another, and also just kind of like see nuance and things like that. So all or nothing thinking kind of falls under that umbrella. That's probably the layman's way to think of it, as oftentimes it's harder for us to examine all sides and kind of look at something in a flexible way. So if we're feeling rejected, we're already going to be emotionally dysregulated. So we're not, thinking at our highest level at that point. And then we're also predisposed to kind of get into that all or nothing thinking. So instead of like being like, okay, well, maybe this is like, they meant this, or this is, the other side of this, we're usually going to kind of naturally, if we are aware of these behaviors and don't have tools to work with it, we're going to want to like kind of assume the worst and kind of dive into that kind of negative thought loop there.
Yeah, I've been there. Why is self-awareness important for managing rejection-sensitive dysphoria? And yeah, I guess on that, how can we harness more self-awareness?
Well, I think self-awareness is so important with so many facets of ADHD, but specifically with RSD, if we can't notice the reaction and name it for what it is, then we really struggle to be able to manage that reaction and be able to use tools to regulate ourselves. And what can happen is if we're feeling all these rejections, all we know is that it feels awful and that we don't want to feel that again. And we don't have tools to process it and get ourselves back into a good place, then we're going to start avoiding things. We're going to start not wanting to have those experiences. And if we're not aware that that's a problem and that that's something that is part of how we're wired, then we just start to believe, okay, no, anything that's going to be putting me vulnerable to rejection is bad. I got to stay away from that. So self-awareness really needs to come into play there, so that you might not avoid feeling rejected. Like those horrible feelings are not going to always be something that we can get rid of in our lives. But if we can name it and start to find ways to externalize the emotion and process it, then we're not going to be as impaired by the after effects of having those types of reactions.
Yeah. As you were talking and also like reading your book, I was thinking of like that reactive state, getting into that reactive state when someone has rejected you or you perceive a rejection. Because I feel like 90% of the time it's a perceived rejection. It's not even a real rejection in my case. That self-awareness piece is so key, and it's so hard, like for me, where I would notice that I can reflect on something after it happened and be like, okay, I got triggered, I got emotional, I didn't react in the best way. But the hardest piece is being able to catch yourself before you react and regulate and then respond. And so you talk about these strategies in your book, but I'm curious if you have any insights on kind of how we can work on catching ourselves before the emotional brain takes over and it's too late, and now it's like an hour later and you're like, why did I do that?
Yeah, I mean, it sometimes can be easier said than done to be able to, I don't know, I guess what I want to say is it's like you can make progress, but you're still going to have those moments where you're going to go into that reaction. Like it can really overpower us. I think that understanding what your triggers are that kind of cause those reactions can be really important. So you can do some mental prep and talk yourself through that as you are experiencing that. Like that's more useful when that there might be some rejection coming, right? Like that's helpful when we're thinking about the writing world, right? To know like, okay, I will be getting some negative reviews, and kind of doing that coping ahead of talking yourself through what these reviews could mean, reminding yourself that it's not about you, something I did for this specific example is I was really scared of what those types of reviews and what they would feel like for me, because as we know, we can't publish a book and not experience some rejection somewhere. And I actually read like 2 and 3 star reviews of books that I loved, like books that I thought were absolutely excellent. And it reminded me that even things that I thought were absolutely wonderful, other people didn't like. And it wasn't about like trying to feel better that someone else was getting a bad review. It was more about reminding myself that it's okay for someone to feel that way about my book, and that doesn't mean that it's a bad book. And that was kind of helpful to kind of talk myself down with that. And then there's also just like everyday things you can do to increase that ability to tolerate those negative feelings. So a lot of things that help us kind of just have that bigger space for regulation are things that are like exercising as much as you can. Not as much as you can. Exercising regularly. There could be too much of a good thing, right? But regular exercise, sunlight, community, not being isolated, all of those things strengthen our ability to tolerate stressors. So there's those lifestyle factors as well. I also think that knowing when you're not in the greatest place to receive rejection can be really helpful. Like if you're exhausted, if you have gone through some major stressors, that's a good time to protect yourself from kind of unwanted feedback and things like that. It's okay to take those times to like recover and face those rejections when you are in a more regulated place.
Meredith, thank you so much for your time. This conversation was amazing. I highly recommend that you subscribe to both Substacks, Instagram, and buy the book. I love the book. They'll all be linked in the show notes. Meredith, thank you so much again. This was My Rejection Story, hosted by me, Alice Draper.